a German philosopher who actually started out as a philologist, basically a scholar of language and texts. He ended up poking at the very foundations of 19th century Europe, the politics, the economics, even the sacred ground of science. He thought the whole thing reeked of decay, of people shrinking back from life instead of leaning into it. And unlike the old philosophical tradition of chasing objective truths or some neat universal morality, Nietzsche flat out refused. He wanted to dig into the psychology, the history, the messy human impulses that actually give birth to the values we hold so high. Spoiler, he didn't think they came from God or reason. For him, it was all about this raw, underlying life drive, what he called the will to power. At the heart of his critique sits morality. Now, most of us grew up thinking of morality like a rule book carved in stone, timeless, untouchable. Nietzsche? Not even close. He split morality into two clashing kinds: master morality and slave morality. The first one, born out of strength, vitality, and confidence, belongs to the ruling class, people unashamed of power who define good on their own terms. The second, which comes from the oppressed, is tinged with resentment. It flips the script, painting weakness as good and strength as evil. Honestly, when I first read this, I caught myself thinking about schoolyard dynamics, how the picked-on kid sometimes develops a moral superiority just to cope. That's basically Nietzsche's point, just scaled up to human history. This whole contrast is what he built his genealogical method on, tracing back the origins of our morals, not as eternal truths, but as evolving weapons and shields in the struggle of life. In the end, his dive into master and slave morality isn't just some dusty historical note. It's a bomb dropped right onto how we still like to think of good and evil today. Nietzsche's boldest move, maybe his most outrageous, was to say that good and evil aren't timeless truths at all, but just weapons in a power game. Imagine that. All those sermons, moral codes, grand philosophies, reduced to strategy. He thought these words weren't discovered in some objective sense, but invented by different groups to keep themselves on top, to justify their way of being. And in saying this, he wasn't just throwing shade at a few priests or philosophers. He was basically challenging thousands of years of tradition that swore morality was universal, handed down, unquestionable. In Nietzsche's world, morality didn't even start with good versus evil. Nope. The original contrast was good versus bad. That's the language of what he called master morality. And here's the kicker. Good didn't mean morally pure. It meant us, the strong, the noble, the healthy, the brave. The aristocrats slapped that label on themselves like a badge. Bad was just everyone else, the weak, the ordinary, the timid. It wasn't condemnation in the moral sense, more like they're not us, almost like taste or style. Nietzsche even calls it the pathos of distance, that deep separation the ruling class felt from the masses they ruled. Honestly, you can still see shades of this today in how elites carry themselves with this unspoken, we're different vibe. But the good versus evil setup, that came later, and it came from below. That's slave morality. Nietzsche says it was born out of resentment, this simmering resentment of the oppressed who couldn't fight their masters physically, so they fought back with values instead. They flipped the script. Suddenly, the master's virtues, strength, pride, wealth, were rebranded as evil. And the slave's own survival traits, humility, patience, sympathy, were elevated as good. It was a massive reversal, a whole revaluation of what counted as moral. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. In today's world, we're still living with those categories. When someone praises humility or shakes their head at pride, are they tapping into some cosmic truth? Or are they echoing this old herd morality that favors safety, sameness, mediocrity over risk, ambition, greatness? I remember catching myself once quietly judging someone's arrogance and then thinking, wait, why do I automatically call that bad? Nietzsche makes you squirm like that. Because his point is clear. Even our most modern ethical debates aren't as fresh as they look. There's still shadows of this ancient tug of war between two utterly different ways of valuing life. To really get Nietzsche's point, you've got to buy into his brutal little history lesson about where morality came from. He doesn't sugarcoat it. In books like Beyond Good and Evil, he basically says that every real elevation of humanity wasn't built on peace or cooperation or some kumbaya vision of progress. It was built on aristocracies. on conquest. That's a hard pill to swallow if you grew up with the usual story of civilization as gradual enlightenment. Nietzsche paints this picture of these so-called barbarians, his word, storming into softer, weaker communities. Men with raw willpower and a hunger for dominance. And here's the twist. They weren't just stronger in muscle, they were stronger in spirit. He calls them more complete men. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't seek approval. They just looked at themselves and said, this strength, this vitality, this pride, that's good. Everyone else, the masses, the timid, the ordinary, bad, not evil, just lesser. And it started there, not with actions, but with people. Noble versus despicable. It's almost unnerving, the bluntness of it. I remember reading this for the first time and thinking of playground hierarchies, honestly. The confident kids who just decide what's cool and what's lame without a vote. Nietzsche's aristocrats were that on a terrifying scale. Slave morality, on the other hand, has a totally different origin story. It doesn't start by affirming itself. It starts by pointing the finger, by resenting. The oppressed, the downtrodden, the ones who couldn't fight back physically, what could they do? They redefined the game. Their first moral act was to name the noble as evil. The strong, the proud, the ones who inspired fear, suddenly they were cast as villains. And from there, the slaves cobbled together their own good, harmlessness, kindness, sympathy, safety disguised as virtue. Nietzsche even goes so far as to say that in languages shaped by this morality, good often edges into meanings like gullible or naive, which, if I'm honest, rings true. How often do we treat being too nice as a kind of foolishness? And this flips the whole script we're usually taught. Morality in Nietzsche's retelling isn't a march toward wisdom or enlightenment. It's not humanity slowly waking up to truth. It's the triumph of one group's value system over another's, the victory of weakness over strength, resentment over affirmation. Which raises the uncomfortable question, do our modern values really help humanity grow into something higher? Or are they more about taming us, domesticating us, making sure no one sticks their head too far above the herd? Nietzsche doesn't exactly answer that for us, but he definitely makes you wonder. Master morality, at least in Nietzsche's framing, belongs to the kind of person who doesn't need anyone else to tell him what's right. He's the source of his own values, strong-willed, independent, proud. His moral code? It's built around power, nobility, self-mastery. He doesn't buy into the whole good versus evil game. That's slave stuff. His compass is simpler, sharper, good and bad, which in practice means noble versus despicable. The noble type doesn't look around for permission. He creates values the way an artist creates a painting, out of an inner abundance. He honors the things he finds in himself. Strength, self-control, respect for his ancestors, the ability to stay grateful for years or hold a grudge for just as long. Even his generosity comes from surplus, not softness. He helps the unfortunate, not because he's overwhelmed with pity, but because he's overflowing with power. Pity, in his eyes, is weakness. Honestly, I can't help but think of that old Viking line Nietzsche loved, Wotan placed a hard heart in my breast. It's the same spirit, pride in being unsentimental, proud of not being built for sympathy. But here's the kicker. This morality isn't universal. It's aristocratic. The noble man feels duties only to his equals, to the ones who stand on his level. Everyone else, they're beneath that bond. He doesn't torment them out of cruelty. That's not the point. It's just that he isn't bound by some overarching moral law toward them. He acts as he pleases, guided by the distance he feels between himself and the masses. Nietzsche calls this the pathos of distance, that instinctive gap the noble feels between his world and theirs. And while it sounds harsh, and it is harsh, the point isn't sadism. It's that the lower orders are simply the ground on which a higher type of human being can build something greater. At the heart of master morality, really at the heart of Nietzsche's whole worldview, is this wild metaphysical idea he called the will to power. And no, it's not just the will to survive or some boring lust for political control. It's deeper than that. For Nietzsche, it's the pulse of life itself, the basic drive in every living thing to push outward, to overcome, to test itself against resistance, to flex its strength simply because it's there. In his eyes, to live is to will power. Full stop. He puts it in his usual sharp, unsettling way. Life is essentially appropriation, injury, come the strange and weak, suppression, severity, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. Brutal words, right? Even Nietzsche admits they sound ugly, but he insists this is biology, this is nature. To dream up a world where no one exploits or exerts themselves is as absurd, he says, as imagining a creature that doesn't breathe or eat. I remember pausing over that the first time I read it, feeling the reflex to argue back, and then realizing how often we try to dress up human ambition in softer language. But Nietzsche refuses to play nice about it. And here's where it gets interesting. This will to power isn't just about lords crushing peasants or nations conquering nations. It shows up everywhere. In the noble's instinct to create new values, in the artist's stubborn need to shape chaos into something beautiful, in the philosopher's urge to reorder the world with ideas. It's the engine humming beneath every cultural achievement, every leap forward. He even calls it the self-surmounting of man, that restless urge we have to grow past what we were yesterday. Of course, plenty of critics read this and say, so Nietzsche just glorifies cruelty, tyranny, domination. And sure, fascists later twisted his words into a weapon, which is tragic. But that's not really it. The highest form of the will to power isn't trampling others. It's turning inward. It's self-overcoming. It's the noble man who pushes himself to master his own instincts, who can endure hardship and even seeks it out, just to grow tougher, sharper, fuller. He has power not only over others, but more importantly over himself. And that flips the whole thing on its head. The will to power is just as much about discipline and self-mastery as it is about outward influence. Slave morality, as Nietzsche sketches it, couldn't be further from the noble ideal. It doesn't come from overflowing strength, but from the bruised, the exhausted, the powerless, the ones too worn down to command life, so they endure it. It's a morality born out of reaction, out of saying no to what it can't match. Its prized values, sympathy, kindness, humility. Nietzsche waves these off as herd morality, the moral code of those who huddle together for safety. And it makes sense when you think about it. If you can't dominate the world, you learn to survive it. Patience, humility, friendliness, these become less about virtue in some higher sense and more about practical tools. They're useful, almost the only way to carry the weight of existence when you don't get to call the shots. Slave morality is clever in its way. It pulls a neat trick. Weakness gets spun into virtue. Meekness is rebranded as goodness. Obedience as righteousness. Inability to strike back, that's suddenly forgiveness. It's the psychology of the cornered animal that convinces itself staying put was its plan all along. Honestly, I've seen shades of this even in everyday life. People reframing what they had to do as what they chose to do. But the real fuel here is resentment. That deep, simmering resentment of the slave toward the master. He looks at the powerful and mutters, sure, they look happy, but they're rotten inside. It's not real. Because he can't win in the master's arena, he flips the script. The noble's values get condemned. Strength, vitality, daring, now painted as evil. The noble himself is recast as a threat, dangerous, wicked. And in opposition, the good man emerges, the safe one, the tame one, the one who won't hurt you. And here's the kicker. Slave morality doesn't just sit quietly with its own values. It wants to universalize them, to spread them, to tame everyone. It dreams of a world where no one sticks their neck out too far, where the herd is safe, comfortable, unthreatened, security over greatness, equality over distinction, comfort over risk. It's protective, sure, but also smothering, an instinct to level the peaks so no one dares climb higher. Nietzsche does this razor-sharp thing when he digs into Vanity. It's one of his best psychological sketches of the slave mindset. He points out that a noble man, the real aristocratic type, can hardly even grasp vanity. Why? Because he already sets his own value. He doesn't sit around waiting for applause. The thought of craving someone else's approval of something he doesn't already believe about himself, Nietzsche says it feels distasteful to him, beneath him, like self-disrespect. Vanity, in contrast, is born straight out of inferiority. Nietzsche ties it back to history. The dependent man, the one under rule, was only that which he passed for. His worth wasn't his own. It was handed to him by the master. And over generations, that habit sank deep. It carried on like some leftover instinct, what Nietzsche calls an extraordinary atavism. Even now, the vain person waits for the world to tell him who he is. He's tuned to public opinion like a radio, instinctively bending toward it. Honestly, it reminds me of scrolling through social media and watching people's moods rise and fall on likes and comments. It's the same old wiring. The vain person swings back and forth with every judgment. Praise feels like sunlight. Criticism stings like poison. And it doesn't even matter if the opinion is true or useful. What matters is that someone else said it. That's the slave in the blood, as Nietzsche puts it, breaking through. That old instinct to submit, to lean on an outside authority for value, never quite dies. It just shifts shape. Instead of a master with a whip, it's the faceless crowd, or public opinion, playing the role. Which is why Nietzsche sees Vanity as so revealing. It exposes the heart of slave morality. It's dependence dressed up as selfhood. It's proof that when you can't generate your own value, you'll always be looking for someone else to hand it to you. For Nietzsche, this wasn't just abstract theorizing. It was a direct jab at the moral systems that had shaped Western civilization, especially Judeo-Christian ethics. He thought the rise of slave morality had dulled us, leveling humanity into what he called mediocrity. It kept people safe, sure, but at the cost of possibility, of greatness. And when he talks about going beyond good and evil, he isn't telling us to throw morality in the trash. He's asking us to grow a spine, to stop leaning on the herd's cozy doctrines and dare to ask, are these values really mine, or were they handed to me centuries ago by the defeated, the fearful? That's the real challenge, terrifying, honestly. To become someone who creates values rather than just inherits them. To affirm life not just when it's pretty, but in all its raw, painful, chaotic beauty. Nietzsche's words still hit like a punch because they're not just history. They're a dare, a reminder that maybe the hardest question we'll ever face is this: who are we really, and who might we have the courage to become? If ideas like these spark your curiosity, subscribe so you never miss the next big question we explore.